Good evening, I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it's a real delight to welcome you all to our 2024 Augustus and Patricia Tagliaferri Dean's Distinguished Lecture with our distinguished guest, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. Before we get started, we do have some distinguished guests as well. First, I'd like to thank really one of Pepperdine's great leaders, our Chancellor for Pepperdine University, Sarah Jackson, is with us today. I know we also have our graduate students here, so if we can see a show of hands from our current SPP graduate students, great to have you here. And also just a show of hands as well for board members from the School of Public Policy who are here with us today. Thank you so much. The Augustus and Patricia Tagliaferri Dean's Distinguished Lecture was endowed by the late Gus Tagliaferri over 7 years ago. And as you can see from the event brochure, we've welcomed a number of great scholars and leaders to Malibu and downtown Los Angeles who've been able to synthesize the importance of history, philosophy, and faith into their public service careers and scholarship. Gus was a true Renaissance man, a brilliant businessman. He was one of the most widely read men that I've ever known. We worked closely in choosing those first lecturers over those first few years, and I know he'd be so excited about tonight's speaker, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. In many ways, this lecture is a co-curricular representation of our larger MPP program, one that combines analytic coursework with studies in history and political philosophy to prepare policy leaders for the future. Tonight, we welcome someone who has committed his life to public service, while at the same time understanding that public leadership is at its best when it includes both the measurable and immeasurable. It involves the practice of virtues, of courage, and honor as it applies the skills of policy analysis. H.R. McMaster is the Fuad Michel Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is also the Bernard and Susan Liautaud Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and a lecturer at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. Upon graduation from the U.S. Military Academy in 1984, McMaster served as a commissioned officer in the United States Army for 34 years. He retired as a lieutenant general in June of 2018 after serving as our 25th assistant to the U.S. President for National Security Affairs. He has commanded organizations in wartime, including the Combined Joint Interagency Task Force, Shafafiyat, in Kabul, Afghanistan from 2010 to 2012, the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Iraq from 2005 to 2006, and Eagle Troop, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Operation Desert Storm from 1990 to 1991. McMaster has also served overseas as advisor to the most senior commanders in the Middle East, Iraq, and Afghanistan. McMaster holds a PhD in military history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was an assistant professor of history at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He is the author of several best-selling books, including Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, and Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. In August of this year, McMaster released his most recent book, At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. McMaster is also the host of Battlegrounds, Vital Perspectives on Today's Challenges, which is a podcast hosted by the Hoover Institution. But more importantly, and I told him this over lunch, he is also a co-host of my favorite podcast, which is also hosted by Hoover, called Goodfellows. Now, with General McMaster's appearance here, we have now hosted 2 of the 3 main speakers of Goodfellows, as Neil Ferguson was our first Tagliaferri lecturer, And so now I think only John Cochran remains to be invited here. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming our 2024 Tagliaferri Lecturer, General H.R. McMaster.
Hey, thank you so much, Dean Peterson and Chancellor Jackson. Thanks for the opportunity to be with all of you. Thanks to all of you for coming tonight. And I'm just glad we're not doing this outside, like overlooking the Pacific. I don't know how do you get any work done here on this campus at all? You know, it's unbelievable. So it's just a real thrill to be here at Pepperdine. And I was telling the Chancellor that my niece went here for law school and my sister-in-law went here for law school, and I've just heard so many fantastic things about your university. And I know many of your scholars and admire your scholars here. So it's great to be with all of you. So, I mean, not to bring anybody down, you know, but I'm going to be talking about the world today and the problems that we're facing, which are significant and mounting, I believe, because of this coalescing of an axis of aggressors. And I'm talking about two revisionist or revanchist powers on the Eurasian landmass of China and Russia, but also how they pulled into the fold the theocratic dictatorship in Iran and the only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world in North Korea. But what I'd like to do is really talk a little bit about the strategic competence, like what it is and why it's super important, obviously, for us to improve our strategic competence today because of these mounting challenges associated with what I would call an axis of aggressors. And, you know, I'm sure that this kind of phenomenon that I'm about to describe happens in all different walks of life. But in the Army, you know, when you first go into the Army as a lieutenant, you go maybe out on your first field training exercise, you know, and you look around and we have this saying in the Army, snafu, you know. Sometimes things don't always go according to plan. But you look around and you think, man, things are kind of messed up, but I'm sure somebody up there has a plan, you know. And then you're like a mid-level officer, you're like a major or something, right? Or a lieutenant colonel, and you're on an exercise and things aren't going well, and you think, man, things are really screwed up. And it dawns on you, I don't think anybody has a plan, you know? And then, like, if you're a general officer or if you're a senior level responsibility, you look around and you think, man, things are messed up. It better dawn on you, it's your job to make the plan, you know? And so that was kind of the situation I found myself in as somebody who was complaining quite a bit about strategies and policies developed in Washington that made no sense to me in places like Kabul, you know, or Baghdad. And you know, I was aware during this period of time that those policies were based more on fantasy than reality. And Washington really didn't have a firm understanding of the dynamics on the ground or what it takes to implement those policy papers they were developing, you know, in the West Wing or the Eisenhower Executive Office building of the White House. In fact, at one point I was complaining in Iraq as Iraq was descending downward with increasing violence, a cycle of sectarian violence in 2006 into 2007. I was talking to my trusty sidekick, Colonel Joel Rayburn, if anybody knows him, a fantastic scholar in his own right, on Iraq and the Middle East. And I said, Joel, I mean, how is this possible? I mean, what we're executing here is a rush to failure. He goes, well, you don't understand. He said, we're in Iraq, but in Washington, they're writing policies and strategies for MyRaq. And MyRaq can be like whatever you want it to be. So I had an opportunity maybe to administer a corrective to this and other unwise policies in 2017 as I was, you know, walking down the street at Walnut Street in my hometown of Philadelphia. Moment of silence for the Phillies. I mean, I'm pretty crushed about it. I'm trying not to get distracted, you know. But my phone rings, and it was a partially blocked Washington, D.C. number, and it was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the White House. And she introduced herself as Katie Walsh, and I'm calling on behalf of President Trump. He would like you to go to Mar-a-Lago tomorrow to interview for the job as National Security Advisor. And so this kind of came quite out of the blue. I wound up actually traveling to Mar-a-Lago, to Palm Beach on Sunday, and went in for the interview. I think President Trump hired me on the spot. There were 3 more interviews to go. It made everybody quite nervous about that. I got called in for a second interview, didn't know who the second interview was until I ran into Ambassador John Bolton quite awkwardly in the men's room. He was on his way out, I was on my way in. It was like one of those moments, oh, Ambassador, oh, General, you know. And then And I walked down into the, that understated room, the living room in Mar-a-Lago, And, and the president came out and said, General, you're hired. There's no reason for another interview. And he started talking about how to announce it and so forth. So this was President's Day weekend. On a Monday, I flew back with the president to Washington on Air Force One. I didn't live in Washington. So they had aircraft ready to fly me back to Tidewater, Virginia to pack a bag. And I started work, and I flew back on those aircraft the next day and started work Tuesday afternoon. So not a lot of time, right, to kind of consider the job or prepare, specifically for the job. But as I looked back on my career, I was very grateful for the opportunity to have jobs that allowed me to lead, interdepartmental teams, multinational teams, to try to frame complex problems and understand them, and then galvanize action to overcome obstacles to progress, take advantage of opportunities, and accomplish our goals and objectives. But when I looked back on my career, I thought, what prepared me the most for this position? And it really was my opportunity, this great opportunity the Army gave me to study at the graduate level, to go to UNC Chapel Hill and study military history and American diplomatic history, and to write the book I wrote as my dissertation, Dereliction of Duty. And so as I walked in to the West Wing of the White House that Tuesday afternoon, and I sit down in the Office of National Security Advisor, it's quite a surreal feeling to realize now I'm responsible for the national security policy-making and decision-making process that I criticized from the perspective of a historian in connection with the decisions that led to an American war in Vietnam, right? So it's like one of those, okay, smarty pants, Now it's your policy process. So I took out a legal pad, kind of analog person that I am, and I wrote down what I thought were the 5 big lessons that from that period of time. So I really wrote about November of 1963, at the time of Kennedy's assassination, and 2 weeks after Ngo Dinh Diem's assassination in Vietnam, the big turning point in the war, when Lyndon Johnson assumed responsibility for Vietnam War strategy until 1965, by the time in which Vietnam was transformed into an American war. And those 5 lessons began with, hey, take time to think about the complex challenges we're facing. What I realized in my research was that all the meetings began, and I had all these exquisite records that had just been declassified, tapes of the meetings and telephone conversations. These conversations and meetings all began with, okay, what are we going to do about it? Well, about what is it? What is the nature of the challenge? What is the nature of the problem in Vietnam? And so I resolved, okay, we're going to take more time to think about the nature of the challenges we're facing before we rush into action. The second big lesson was that, you're going to say, okay, this is kind of obvious, right? It's important to have goals and objectives. Okay, but during the period in which Vietnam became an American war, McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor at the time, said, hey, it's better not to have an objective in Vietnam, because that way, if we don't accomplish that objective, it'll, quote, give the president more flexibility in the domestic political arena. So I guess, that's kind of like the Alice in Wonderland approach to war. I don't think that really worked. Any path will get you there. And then the third key lesson was important to make your assumptions explicit. I really think that 90% of the flaws in U.S. policies and strategies have to do with implicit assumptions. And because they're implicit, they don't get challenged. Think about some of them. Okay, let's think about a few. Putin just needs to have his security concerns placated or allayed, and then he'll be nicer, right? He'll stop his campaigns of aggression. How many administrations fell into that trap? Or how about this one? China, having been welcomed into the international order, international economic order, would play by the rules. And as China prospered, it would liberalize its economy and liberalize its form of governance. Or how about this one? That all we just need to do about North Korea is be patient, and that regime will collapse. Or we just need to have an opening to North Korea. Remember the sunshine policy, and the regime will collapse. Or how about, if we welcome the Iranians into the international order, give them sanctions relief, then the Ayatollah will be like the Grinch on Christmas Eve. His heart will grow 2 sizes bigger, and he'll give back all the presents to Whoville across the Middle East. How's that working out? So I just think we have to make those assumptions explicit, challenge them. That was like lesson number 3. The fourth was a really important one, and I took with me when I went to Mar-a-Lago, I took with me this book called Presidential Command by Peter Rodman. Fantastic book, by the way. Any of you in policy curriculum, just read at least the conclusion of that book. And I turned to the conclusion, and I saw a highlighted passage, and it was about the importance of giving the president multiple options. And it's important to give the president multiple options because guess what? It's the president who got elected. Nobody elected you, National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, Defense. Right? So the president deserves multiple options. And then also, it's important to give multiple options because it's in the comparison of those options that you can draw out kind of the long-term costs and consequences, compare them to one another, assess risk more effectively, assess opportunity more effectively. So I resolved, okay, we're going to give President Trump multiple options. And then finally, and I alluded to this earlier with the McGeorge Bundy quotation, we would try to fence off this national security decision-making and policy-making process from partisan political considerations. And you might think, oh, that's just like a naive general, you know? Well, but I knew there would be people who would have voices about partisan political concerns, but I didn't want that to infect the process of developing options for the president, especially in vital matters of national security. So we endeavored to put into place a process that avoided those mistakes, and so I would make at least new mistakes rather than make those same old mistakes. But also associated with strategic competence, besides kind of heeding those lessons, and I would define strategic competence broadly as the integration of all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners to overcome obstacles to progress, take advantage of opportunities, and achieve clearly defined goals and objectives. I think that's what strategic competence fundamentally is. But to pursue competence, I think you also have to set priorities, right? If everything's a priority, hey, nothing's a priority. And then also what you have to do is you have to get out of the tactical decision making. You've got to extend your time horizon. You don't need the White House telling the Department of Defense, specific things to do or put restrictions on them. So in my first day, I said I want a list of every authority that has been centralized within the White House and taken away from the departments of agencies. And we began to prepare memorandum after memorandum for the president's signature to devolve those responsibilities back. Okay, the White House had decreed that you could only have 3 attack helicopters in Syria at any one time. I mean, what? Why? Or that you had to submit like the invasion of Normandy plan and ask permission to sail through the South China Sea. I'm like, hey, the last time I checked, China doesn't own the ocean. Just sail whenever you want. Don't even tell us, President Trump didn't want to know. Just sail through the ocean, So all of these are some examples of getting out of the tactical business that was a distraction and extending kind of our horizons. But again, going back to priorities, and this is in the book, I just wrote out on that same legal pad what I believe were the 16 first-order challenges we were facing from the perspective of international security and foreign policy. These were geostrategic challenges, for example, how to prevent China from establishing exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific and creating new spheres of influence across the world in an effort to rewrite the rules of international discourse in favor of its authoritarian model of governance, and its statist mercantilist economic model. Okay, quite a mouthful, but we still need to do that, by the way. And then the second, is another one, just another example, a short one but a complex one, how to stabilize Iraq and ensure that Iraq is not aligned with Iran, right? You get kind of the idea of the geostrategic challenges, and then also there were challenges associated with certain domains, right? How to maintain U.S. access to critical capabilities in space, and countering adversary efforts to weaponize space and deny us those capabilities. Same thing with cyberspace and so forth. So these 16 challenges, we decided, okay, now let's put together a process. Put together a process where we can begin to shift toward strategic competence, away from fantasy in Washington toward reality, and to put a process in place that addressed those 5 key lessons that I had learned from reading and studying and researching and writing about how and why Vietnam became an American war. And just broadly, as you know, the best way to learn something is to teach it, from teaching national security and diplomatic history at West Point, military history at West Point. So what we did is we put into place a principal small group framing session. I'll use some of these examples just to kind of illuminate these live challenges, these challenges that are still quite live today that we're facing. And the first of these was to convene the principals committee around a principal small group framing session on North Korea. And with North Korea to challenge the assumptions of previous policies, to kind of flip them on their head. Hey, Kim Jong-un, he didn't look like much when he came in the job, bad haircut, kind of seemed a little bit comical, but he turned out to be a pretty brutal person. He's got a pretty firm grip on power in North Korea, so they're not going to collapse probably before they become a danger. And also, hey, guess what? He's not going to open up, because if he opens up, he knows it's over for the regime. And then we challenged the assumptions, as I mentioned, right? We described the nature of the problem, then we challenged the assumptions. The assumptions were, Kim Jong-un, he just wants those weapons to deter us. And I started to think about it, because I'm a historian. I'm thinking about who initiated all this aggression, since 1950? I mean, the North, right? The invasion of June 1950, every single act of aggression initiated by the North. Well, maybe it's not deterrence they have in mind. Maybe they have something offensive in mind. And by the way, if they want it for deterrent purposes, they have masses of artillery within the range of Seoul. They'd get that with conventional weapons. So maybe they actually want those nuclear weapons to do what the Kim family regime has said it wants to do since its inception, which was to unify the peninsula under the red banner by force if necessary. And that gives you a whole different framing, a whole different sense of urgency. And then we decided, okay, we need to test the thesis then, based on these new assumptions, that Kim Jong-un can be convinced that he's safer without the weapons than he is with them. And that led to the strategy of maximum pressure, which involved financial and economic actions, but also interdiction, also the threat of force, right? Because I think what we tend to forget is what, real privilege to have been his colleague briefly at Hoover, George Shultz said, who passed away at the age of 100, still kind of on the job at the Hoover Institution. He said, negotiation is a euphemism for capitulation unless the shadow of power is cast across the bargaining table, right? And so think about how we've forgotten that, right? I mean, think about how nonsensical we've been by giving the Taliban, oh, here's our schedule for withdrawal from Afghanistan. And now we'd like to talk with you about like a negotiated settlement, Or to say to the Israelis, we need a ceasefire, right? And then negotiate something with Hamas where they still have the guns in Gaza, or Hezbollah still has capabilities that can threaten the Israeli population in the northern part of the country. So think about the things we've heard, right? There's no military solution in Afghanistan. Well, the Taliban came up with one, didn't they? So it's really about the integration of military efforts and diplomatic efforts. We seem to have forgotten. So we endeavored with this new strategy of maximum pressure to try to convince Kim Jong-un again that he was safer without the weapons than he was with them. That's a strategy of maximum pressure. I think it began to work, but we didn't really have a great partner in the Moon government in South Korea. And President Trump, can't pass up the opportunity for a big deal, right? I mean, I knew he wouldn't pass it up. And so when he had the first summit in Singapore, then a lot of the pressure just dissipated naturally, right? He stuck to what we said was one of our principles, and I write about this in the book, but to not alleviate the pressure until there was irreversible momentum toward denuclearization. He stuck to that. But our international partners are like, hey, they're talking now, right? We can let up a little bit on the pressure. And then the president did the right thing by walking out in Hanoi, but came pretty close to entering into a pretty bad deal in the pursuit of getting a deal. Well, I'll just fast forward now because we're talking about these challenges from the axis of aggressors and these cascading crises. What's Kim Jong-un up to now? I think right now he's kind of waiting for Donald Trump, And what he's trying to do is to engage in provocations, restarting cruise missile tests, ICBM tests, all kind of threatening rhetoric, tearing down the reunification arch, writing into the Constitution, hey, South Korea is the real enemy. Because what he wants to say to President Trump is, you're not the enemy. So, South Koreans, you're wasting all this money, with U.S. forces posted there, right? So what he hopes he's going to get is a weak nuclear deal, kind of like the Iran nuclear deal. and get an agreement to withdraw U.S. forces from the peninsula. Will he get that? There's no way he's going to get that. But I think that's what he's thinking. I mean, these are people, the North Koreans watch the show The West Wing to figure out how the U.S. government works. You know what I mean? So they may not be totally clued in to how that will be received in the United States. So the second big effort for us to reframe was on China. So we got this policy in place. I took the job in February. The new strategy for North Korea was in place in March. A lot of that work was done in advance by a fantastic person, Matt Pottinger, who was our senior director for Asia, and he's a colleague at Hoover now, and became deputy national security advisor under Robert O'Brien, my friend, who was the previous lecturer here. Pottinger kind of had that in the can already, right? And he was educating me about the challenges in Asia. I'd spent most of my time in the Middle East and in Europe and so forth. And the next big thing was China, right? And we knew China was a huge challenge. We all believed that the assumptions that we had clung to for too long were no longer valid. So in March, I convened the Principal Small Group, which we now had a formal name for that was kind of long, the Principal Small Group Framing Session, right? Where we organized our discussions around a 5-page paper. Probably sounds familiar to some of you master's students in policy. And that 5-page paper was organized with a description of the nature of the challenge, a draft of the overarching goal, more specific objectives. Actually, before that, our vital interests that were at stake. What's the so what? Why do we care about that? The assumptions, and then obstacles to progress and opportunities. And then it stopped. 5 pages, that's it. And I'll tell you, man, I was hard on this, like grading papers, I took out hundreds of adjectives, right? I outlawed words that we should never use, right? Leverage, guardrails, seamless. I mean, like, what do you mean, And so no passive voice, like, short set. I mean, so they were tight papers, and then we had a discussion about, hey, do you agree with this framing for the first half of the meeting? We wouldn't talk about like what we're going to do about anything. Do we have this description of the challenge from the Chinese Communist Party right? Again, we flipped assumptions on their head, and we did it to counter what I would call in my previous book, Battlegrounds, strategic narcissism, the tendency to view the world only in relation to us, and assume that what we do or choose not to do is decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. Right? That's a problem because it's self-referential. And it's a problem because it denies the agency or the authorship over the future of the other. It's really a profoundly arrogant view of the world. And so for China, we said, okay, the Chinese Communist Party is driven by ideology and emotion, primarily. And the ideology is the ideology of the party and the ideology to restore China to its rightful place in the world and its drive to do so, this revanchist agenda. But it's driven mainly by that aspiration, but also by fear, the fear of losing its exclusive grip on power. So when you look at the behavior of the CCP, you think, man, that doesn't make sense. Like, how does zero COVID make sense, right? How does bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier? How does committing acts of war against a treaty ally of the United States and the Philippines make sense? How does cracking down on the tech sector when your economy's already tubing? How does it make sense to say, hey, we're open for business because they want U.S. investment, because they want us to underwrite our own demise, which we've been doing for far too long, but then cracking down on all the companies that provide you some kind of transparency, into Chinese companies and so forth, like Bain and others. So it makes sense when you think about how they prioritize the party's grip on power and their fear of losing control. And we put into place a new foundation for a major shift in U.S. foreign policy. I think the biggest shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And at the outset of that meeting, kind of #predictable for a historian, I had asked our NSC historian to provide the previous policy papers from previous administrations going back to the George H.W. Bush administration, post-Cold War China policy. And I read a passage from the Obama administration policy and just noted, hey, we are about to help President Trump effect the most significant shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And that's a shift that has stuck now through the Biden administration. There's a high degree of continuity. How are we doing on that? Let me flash forward now on this challenge from China. China is becoming more and more aggressive. I think because of its fear that a window of opportunity for the Chinese Communist Party is closing. A window of opportunity associated with the frailties in their economy, that they have incurred because of their race to surpass us. And also a demographic time bomb that they're encountering. And then also we're kind of onto them, now. We're no longer playing along with the idea, that they're going to liberalize, or their promise of helping the world, with reducing man-made carbon emissions, which was always a big lie on their part. So I think they see the window closing, they're becoming more aggressive, and they're becoming more anxious. What can we see in the future here? I think that the chances of a massive coercive campaign against Taiwan in the next 3 years or so is well over 90%. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to be a cross-strait invasion. I think we could convince them maybe that won't work, but they'll try everything to get annexation by invitation by the Taiwanese. They'll become more aggressive in enforcing this 9 dash line, as they already are, in the South China Sea. And I think they're going to act in the next 6 to 9 months to crater the U.S. economy. And I think in doing so, by restricting the export of critical materials and minerals, they'll also start to crater their own economy. But, it's kind of like the fable of the scorpion and the frog, They're just good. That's kind of what they do. And I think so we are in for a very rocky time with the CCP. And I think more and more danger is apparent now with their support for Russia's war-making machine, not only in terms of feeding Putin's ATM that he needs to sustain the war in Ukraine, but also providing him with the hardware and electronics and equipment necessary to build the weapons to sustain that onslaught against the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian infrastructure. So how about Russia? You might think, oh, President Trump and Russia, oh man, what's that going to be about? Well, there was this cloud of the Mueller investigation over President Trump. He also is somebody who's reflexively contrarian, right? Everybody told him, hey, Putin's the worst guy, and, he tends to just kind of want to do the opposite of what people tell him. So what we convinced him, though, of in a strategy that he approved in September of 2017 is that we had to impose costs on Putin well beyond those that he factors in when he takes aggressive action against us and our allies. So what people don't realize, I think, is in that first year of the Trump administration, President Trump imposed more sanctions on Russian entities and individuals than in the previous 8 years of the Obama administration. He closed 2 consulates, one in Seattle, one in San Francisco, and expelled scores of Russian undeclared intelligence agents. And he also provided lethal assistance to the Ukrainian armed forces for the first time in the form of Javelin missiles in December of 2017. The reason he did that is I had the opportunity to persuade him that what provokes Putin is the perception of weakness. And I showed him a timeline with acts of, with incidents or events or decisions that portrayed weakness to Putin, and then the act of aggression that followed. And this was in the back room, the dining room of the Oval Office. He had heard from all his advisors already, and he signed that authorization. Now, President Trump, as he did in Afghanistan, which I won't talk about, maybe we could talk about that in the discussion period, he makes tough decisions, but oftentimes can't stick with them, right? He's very disruptive, and there was a lot to be, as I mentioned, a lot to be disrupted in Washington, but he's oftentimes so disruptive that he disrupts himself, right? I mean, that's not a newsflash, right? And so he still held out this illusion. He could get some kind of an entente, from Putin. He's got this great confidence in his ability to make a deal, So on Russia, though, we did put into place that major shift. I believe the Biden administration reversed that. Think about what President Biden did. He went to Geneva. He laid in all the red lines. You know what that means? Green light for Putin to do anything else. He pulled our ships out of the Black Sea to allay Putin's security concerns. Remember I said that's the flawed assumption? Then what did he do? He listed all the things we wouldn't do to support Ukraine. He suspended lethal assistance to Ukraine. He withdrew our advisors from the country and then evacuated our embassy and scuttled our embassy. And it offered Zelensky a ride out, So I wonder why deterrence failed. We did a nifty job of declassifying some intelligence. We protested loudly from a diplomatic perspective. But, Vladimir Putin's not afraid of aggressive diplomacy, right? Not afraid of it. And so on Iran, it was the same kind of an approach, right? The idea that weakness, the perception of weakness is provocative. And we put into place a major shift in Iranian policy. We could talk about that. I think that the value of the approach to the Middle East that constrained Iran, that led to the Abraham Accords. The value of that only became apparent to many after the Biden administration reversed that strategy. And that resulted in really the transfer of about $100 billion into the coffers of the Iranians by not enforcing the Trump-era sanctions. And then also, I think, emboldened Iran because of the perception of weakness and the pursuit of an effort to resurrect the fundamentally flawed Iran nuclear deal. I think also the difficult relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states created an opportunity for the Russians to play the role of both fireman and arsonist, you know, in the Middle East, and made some space for China to come in, right, to come over top of that deal that was brokered for the normalization of Iranian and Saudi relations. And then the difficult relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden, that was a perception of weakness. And then internal to Israel, remember, with the judicial reform effort and everything. So the theme of this, I mean, of all these, you know, axis of aggressors and how they've coalesced, I think, is that the perception of weakness is what is provocative, right? And I think that prior to October 7th, the supreme leader in Iran perceived weakness and decided to activate the ring of fire around Israel. So what do? I think we have to do really two fundamental things. I'll say three, and I'll try to be super quick here. The first is hard power matters. We need to restore deterrence by building up our defense capabilities, ours meaning the United States and our allies and partners internationally. The second thing we have to do is to reduce our vulnerability to coercive economic power wielded by our adversaries, China in particular, with its lock over critical supply chains, and also the degree to which our defense industrial base and our industrial base is atrophied based on China's dominance of manufacturing. And the third thing, I guess I would say, besides those concrete actions, would be we have to improve our strategic competence through some of the techniques I've talked about, but we also have to restore our confidence. You know, if you look at what China, Russia, and Iran in particular are doing from an information perspective, cyber-enabled information warfare against us, they are trying to weaken our confidence in who we are as a people, our common identity as Americans, and our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. I don't think any of them really give a damn. Maybe the Iranians don't want Trump to win because they put a hit out on him, you know. But I think Russia, let's say Russia and China, they don't care who wins as long as large numbers of Americans doubt the legitimacy of the result. So we have a lot of work to do in restoring our confidence in who we are and our democratic principles, institutions, and processes. I believe Pepperdine University is a place that does that. And I applaud this university, for its critical view of our history, which we should have, but also recognizing the great promise of this country and recognizing that our republic has always been and will remain a work in progress, and we can build a better future if we work together. So thanks, and I look forward to hearing where you'd like to take the discussion. Thank you.
So we're going to now enter into a time of Q&A. The way that we do it with the Tagliaferri lecture, especially an audience of this size, we're going to do it by the questions on cards. So you should have cards either at the end of your aisle or they're already in your brochure. And so we have people at the end of the aisles who will be picking up the cards and bringing them back to me. We have a good 20 minutes or so to go through those. I will take the dean's prerogative, HR, and begin with a question that I know you cover sometimes on Goodfellows. It's a metaphor that Neil Ferguson uses as it relates to U.S.-China relations, and it's a term that he has coined that relationship is what he calls Cold War II. And that it is one that, because of our much deeper economic engagement with China versus the Soviet Union, that this is a much more difficult Cold War than what we experienced there. So my question to you is that a helpful metaphor? Is it accurate? And whether it is or isn't, how do we understand the difference or the challenges between our deep economic engagement versus what they may see from a geopolitical standpoint?
Okay, great. I mean, I do think it's a useful analogy as long as you don't take analogies too far, right? There's a great book by Margaret Macmillan called Dangerous Games about the limits of historical analogies. But I really, I think that it works because, hey, if you acknowledge it's a Cold War, maybe you can prevent a hot one. And I think we need to wake up from our holiday from history that we took after the Cold War, in which we bought into 3 overlapping and mutually reinforcing assumptions. The first of which was that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. The second was that, hey, great power rivalry was a relic of the past. And the third was that our prowess, our economic and our technological military prowess, would guarantee our security well into the future. Well, it turns out that actually ideology still does drive and constrain others, and the Chinese Communist Party is not, as Dr. Evil would say, the Diet Coke of communism. Is that a little bit alarming to people? Sorry. It's the real Coke of communism. It really is. And they want to replace the world order with a new order that's sympathetic to their interests, and then finally, they've closed the gap. Right, and maybe exceeded us in some critical technological areas. The Chinese have figured out how to take apart our exquisite military capabilities. So we have to catch up. And I think if you by calling it a Cold War, that kind of wakes us up to a new reality. I think that's okay. In the terms of how intertwined the economies are, there are people who say, well, we can't really decouple. But hey, China's decoupling on its own terms. What China wants to do under the strategy of Made in China 2025 and what Xi Jinping calls the dual circulation economy is to create dependencies on China for critical elements of the supply chain while China is insulated from any kind of economic disruption associated with any penalties, right, for their aggressive actions. And so I think what we have to do is work together in a multinational way, and this is already happening. You might have seen the FT piece a couple days ago about working together to acquire mining rights, but it's going to take a whole range of tools of economic statecraft that we ought to aim to employ without compromising the benefits of our free market economic system and our unbridled entrepreneurialism. And this includes inbound investment screening, outbound investment screening, export controls, investment in industries that will help us kind of leap ahead. I'm thinking of additive manufacturing and the development of the powders and everything associated with that. But then also deregulation and permitting reform. I mean, that's going to be super important. So I think whatever administration comes in has to undertake that holistic approach to whatever you want to call it, de-risking or decoupling from China.
Question here about the war in the Middle East. The questioner asks, how would you advise the next U.S. president on how to handle the war in Gaza, and how much should the U.S. involve our military in this conflict?
Yeah. Well, we're already involved in the conflict, and this is something that nobody's talking about, which I think is was unfortunate that the Biden administration isn't talking about the 175 acts of war that Iran has committed against U.S. forces and U.S. personnel in the Middle East only since October 8th. Okay, we've responded to about 11 of those, and so it already is a regional war. I think Israel is fighting what I would describe as a 7-front war. In Gaza against Hamas, in the West Bank against Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, in Lebanon against Hezbollah, in Syria against an Iranian proxy army that is formed there, about 40,000 strong, in Yemen, who's been firing weapons at them, and then with other militias, for example, the Hashd-e-Shaabi militias in Iraq, which are firing projectiles toward them and actually marching across Syria to join the proxy army, and from Iran, direct attacks, right, in April, 500 or so projectiles and a couple hundred more just recently. So that sounds like a regional war to me. We are actively defending Israel, but you know what? When does it ever make sense to me? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me to only play defense. I mean, would that ever work in any sport? Doesn't work in war either. And so what we have been doing is acting like we don't know what the return address is for all the violence and suffering in the Middle East, which is Iran is the return address for all of this. And so in Gaza, I think that it doesn't make sense to me, okay, to say there should be a ceasefire, and then in the next sentence to say, then we have to get on a path to a enduring security, some sort of an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians or a two-state solution. Hey, if Hamas still has the guns, and it is in their charter that they want to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. That doesn't sound like a two-state solution, to me, right? So I think we have to recognize that a precondition for any kind of enduring peace in the region is the destruction of Hamas. If it were up to me, which it's not, I would have had the Joint Special Operations Command working with the Israelis from day one to go after the hostages, because they're American hostages there. I mean, why is nobody doing that? I mean, I don't understand it. And then even with the Houthis, at first we were just shooting down the missiles, which is, every one of those is like a diving catch, right? Instead of going after the archers. We are a little bit more now. There was an Iranian command post in the port of Hodeidah that is orchestrating all the attacks against the maritime shipping. I don't know why that guy's still alive in that command post. There's an Iranian ship that is anchored just off Djibouti that is collecting all the intelligence used for those attacks against ships. Why is that not on the bottom of the Bab el-Mandeb? I don't understand it. And I think that we often lament Iran's asymmetrical advantages, right? The ability to work through proxies, and really their strategy is to expend every Arab or every Palestinian life in pursuit of its aims to push us out of the region as step A, and then destroy Israel as step B. The other part of this is to keep the Arab world perpetually weak by keeping them enmeshed in the sectarian civil war. The Syrian civil war, which has killed, wounded, or displaced half the Syrian population. I mean, where were the college protests when that was happening, right? I mean, I don't get it. So I just think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what's required to get to an enduring peace in the region. And I think at the same time, though, you can impress upon the Israelis the need to apply firepower with more discipline and discrimination. But you have to also realize where Hania was killed was 3 stories under an apartment building in Beirut, okay? That was his command post. They use hospitals, schools. Whenever the Israeli Defense Forces says, hey, here's a cleared area, guess where the Hamas leadership goes? Into the refugee area, right from the beginning, okay? So I think it's really important to recognize, the nature of your enemy. And I don't think we've done that. We don't talk about it. Hania has said, we know what Israel's weakness is. The Jews, this is almost a direct quotation, the Jews love life. We can take that away from them. We love death, okay? I mean, that's what he would say kind of as a catchphrase after many of his speeches. So think about if we had suffered the October 7th attacks, if they had come across the Mexican border and killed, adjusted for population, 50,000 Americans. And then from Canada, another group was firing hundreds of missiles a day and had forced us to depopulate 10% of our country. And people were living in hotels in cities further south. What would we be doing right now? I mean, I think something a lot more dramatic, actually.
Another question here actually relates, I didn't mention in your bio, one of your appointments was to lead a group looking at the future of war and military conflict. And so this question actually shifts our lens toward Ukraine and the Ukrainian conflict. You obviously are a former tank commander. We are seeing tanks being used as well as drones blowing up tanks. What are we learning about the future of war in what is being fought now in Ukraine?
Okay, what I think we're seeing is the evolution of the character of warfare, but not a shift in the nature of war. And I think this is where we go wrong a lot of times. In the 1990s, which I mentioned, which is a period of maybe over-optimism with those 3 over-optimistic assumptions, an offshoot of that was what was called at the time, the revolution in military affairs, right? The belief that future wars would be fundamentally different from all those that have gone before it. But, and this was based on like Moore's Law and what was going on with information technology, and people forgot what Michael Howard said, is that wars resemble each other more than they resemble any other human activity. And we became captivated by technological change, and we neglected these continuities in the nature of war, which I would just say quickly are 4, right? War's political. Okay, it's like the Geico commercial, like everybody knows that, right? I mean, Clausewitz said war's an extension of politics. But what that means is that it has never been an optional phase in war to consolidate military gains to get to that sustainable political outcome. If the war doesn't require that, that's called a raid, But there always has to be some effort to consolidate gains. The second is that war is human. People fight today for the same reasons Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago: fear, honor, and interest. And if your strategy doesn't address the drivers of those conflicts, and I would argue that Israel's strategy doesn't address that adequately, we can talk more about that, then you're taking actions that could be counterproductive in terms of what you're trying to achieve. The third is that war is uncertain. And this is in the RMA period. People believed that we would have dominant battle space knowledge, and that would lead to what they called at the time. Think about the hubristic nature of this language: full spectrum dominance over all of our adversaries. We would lift the fog of war, in the words of Admiral Owens, who wrote a book of that title. But you know what? Even if you have AI now, large language models, everything that we have to enhance our situational understanding, much of that information is bad, it's contradictory, and it's transitory, because there's a temporal dimension of war that really foils any effort to try to gain comprehensive situational understanding before that situation changes again fundamentally. Because war is really an interaction, continuous interaction of opposites. And then finally, war is a contest of wills. And I think we have to remember those continuities when we think about future war. So drones. Drones are the new thing, but there are countermeasures to drones. Electromagnetic warfare and all sorts of air defense capabilities, soon to be directed energy. There is always that interaction, right? Machine gun tank, tank anti-tank missile, tank drone, submarine sonar, bomber radar. War and warfare, it's rock, paper, scissors. You've got to use all of them in succession and use them where you have an advantage. If you show up with only a rock because you thought the rock was going to be decisive, your enemy's going to have paper, because there are only really two ways to fight in war: asymmetrically and stupidly. And so you hope your enemy picks stupidly, but they're likely to not do so. So you need all those tools available, and your competence as a military commander is how to combine all those capabilities in joint operations to seize, retain, and exploit the initiative over the enemy, to gain a temporal, psychological, positional advantage, and then use that to maintain that initiative until you can achieve the outcome of defeating the enemy. And what does defeating the enemy require? Everybody wants to do like a ceasefire in Ukraine and end the war in 24 hours, President Trump's phrase, Hey, but winning in war still requires convincing your enemy that your enemy's been defeated. Until Putin is convinced that he's been defeated, there is not going to be a favorable, diplomatic or political outcome. Everybody will say, well, wars, they all end diplomatically, so we should just stop military operations. Really? When has there ever been an acceptable political settlement that was inconsistent with what was achieved diplomatically? I think people have this warped view of how the war in the Balkans ended. Right? And they remember Richard Holbrooke, who was a force to be reckoned with, and some kinds of pain in the neck, but I respected him. And the Dayton Accords, right? He just got it done diplomatically, man. That was aggressive diplomacy. Hey, how about the Croatian counteroffensive? That's what really set conditions for the Dayton Accords. So again, we have this incompetence, I think, associated with our failure to realize that the instruments of power must be integrated and consistent with one another. Diplomacy and military working together.
So we have time for one more question, and it's one that I see in several of these cards here as it relates to the upcoming election. So I'll try to phrase this in a way that themes a few of these questions. What concerns you most from a geopolitical perspective, whether former President Trump or Vice President Harris is elected? What are there specific areas that we've touched on, and just focus on the negative, that concerns you about the prospective policies of one administration versus the other?
Okay, and I'll try to do this just because of, on issues. I'm not endorsing any candidate. I wrote this book in a way that I have no political agenda. I just told the story as I experienced it as National Security Advisor and did my best from the perspective of a historian to place my experience in the Trump administration in context of the 8 Obama years that preceded it and the 4 Biden, or almost 4 Biden years that followed it, under the theory that readers can make their own decisions and nobody needs a washed-up general to tell them how to vote. And I'm worried about these days efforts in both political parties to pull the military into partisan politics. And you have, people on the far right saying the military is woke. You have people on the far left saying the military is extremist. Hey, your military is not woke and it's not extremist, okay? And those who try to pull the military into that kind of polarization, we got to tell them hands off, because you don't want to happen to the military what's happened to a lot of higher level education in this country, because that's what you will get, So I just think that if it's a Harris administration, it depends on if you get the Vice President Harris and the Biden policies and a continuation of them, or if you get something fundamentally different. I'm skeptical about getting something fundamentally different, because I think the people who would come into a Harris administration would be kind of the same that are there now. And I know I don't know him well personally, but her national security advisor, and his approach has been, for example, to sign the document that had a lot of signatures from academics saying, hey, we're being too hard on China. I'm like, hey, there's only a small island with people who don't realize the threat from the Chinese Communist Party at this point. And then also, I think the approach toward the Middle East has been, I don't know how else to say it except feckless. It's been feckless. And the supplication to the Iranians has emboldened them. We have done direct transfers to them. Remember, there were $6 billion sitting in a Qatarese bank about to be transferred to the Iranians, unfrozen assets, on October 6th of last year, the day before October 7th. And then there was even like a debate after October 7th, should we still give it to them? I don't really understand it. There's a real blind spot among members of the administration on Iran, for example. They tend to treat our allies like their enemies and our enemies like their friends, since when? We had the Senate Minority Leader call for the resignation of Israel's prime minister. Hey, how about calling for the resignation of the supreme leader, man? In Iran. It just seems kind of crazy to me. So I'm worried about fecklessness, maybe, if it's a Harris administration. On the Trump side, as I mentioned, Trump is disruptive. That can be good, but he's so disruptive that he disrupts himself, and he's consistent on a lot of things, which I think are good. Energy security, burden sharing, for example, reciprocity in trade. That's all good in my view. But he has this sort of inclination toward, or predilection for, retrenchment, for disengagement from the world. This comes from, I think, his deep-seated belief that our allies and friends internationally have been free riding on the largesse of American taxpayers. It also comes, I think, from those in the party, and this is, I'm trying to apply what Zachary Shore calls strategic empathy, right, to others who make these arguments toward retrenchment, who say, hey, man, we got so many problems here at home. What the hell are we doing over there? And of course, the problems we're talking about are the blows that we've experienced, maybe since the trauma of 9/11. But how about the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars? How about the financial crisis, 2008, 2009? Toss in an opioid epidemic. How about the effects of social media that are polarizing our society, decreasing our confidence in who we are? Then we have a pandemic. Then we have January 6th. We have George Floyd's murder and the aftermath. It's like, man, we got a lot of stuff to sort out here. What are we doing? Worried about like South Korea, or Japan, or the South China Sea, or what do you fill in the blank, right? The Middle East. But I think what concerns me is that retrenchment is not in our interest, because if problems develop abroad, they can only be dealt with at an exorbitant cost once they reach our shores. And so I do worry about that impulse toward retrenchment for Trump. So maybe if I could boil it down to words, right? Concern about a Trump administration would be inconsistency, erratic, maybe I would put it if I wanted to use an adjective, right? And for Harris administration, it would be feckless. So take your pick, erratic or feckless.
So I lied. I actually do have one more question. HR, it strikes me that in this audience right now we have a number of students, not just SVP students, but I think we have some Seaver students here. I think we've got some students from Biola and maybe some others. I know that we have some veterans and those currently serving in the audience right now. I wanted you to speak to them You mentioned before some of the challenges that we seem to be having in our institutions and more broadly in the public about a lack of trust in our institutions. But of course, as a policy school, we are preparing people to go in and serve in institutions, and including some that may be on the front lines as it relates to national security issues, to talk about how you see the future and the importance of people considering a life as you have served in public service.
Well, hey, thanks for the question. I'll tell you, I'm concerned about maybe people being less willing to serve because it all looks like a mess, doesn't it? You know, and in the book, I really tried to make that a theme. You know, it's not like a woe is me book. I mean, it was a privilege to serve in that position, and when I took the job as National Security Advisor, I thought it was a great gift. You know, I'm still grateful for President Trump for the opportunity, but I got used up in that job. But I was at peace with that because that job is more important than any one individual. You know, so I think what happens today is that popular culture and sort of you know, the drumbeat of like partisan news on cable TV in particular, you know, has really made service seem less attractive because everybody wants somebody to pick a side, like pick a partisan side, and you've got to be loyal to that particular corner. When I think the time is now for us to transcend all that. I think Americans are indicating their desire to do so as more and more Americans are registering as independents, for example, you know, and leaving kind of the shrinking tents of the two political parties. But I also think that for the military in particular, popular culture cheapens and coarsens the warrior ethos. And what the warrior ethos means to me is it's really a covenant between those who fight and serve in our name and those and our society, right? And it's also a covenant between warriors of really based on values, right? Values like the sense of honor, the courage, the willingness to sacrifice for one another and for the mission. And what Americans tend to see, even in like the well-meaning commercials, you know, to support veterans who have been wounded in combat or Gold Star families and so forth, there's an impression in popular culture that veterans are traumatized, fragile human beings, and that service in our military is universally, you know, traumatic and arduous. And there are parts of service that are arduous. I mean, you know, you're likely to find yourself in harrowing situations. You're fortunate if you don't have to cope with the most difficult experience in combat, which is seeing somebody who you love and care about killed or seriously wounded in battle. But what people don't see are those less tangible rewards of service. Being part of a mission bigger than yourself, being part of an organization in which the man or woman next to you is willing to give everything, including their own lives for you. An organization that really takes on the qualities of a family that's bound together by mutual purpose and common purpose, mutual respect and really affection for one another. And so I think we have to try to communicate that more to young people and help them understand better like the rewards of service. And I think a lot of this is based on, you know, what I would call, I'm just going to say kind of a more, you know, this is not going to have a lot of nuance in it, so I want to be brief. But I do think there is sort of a curriculum of self-loathing that has come to dominate a lot of our humanities departments and our kind of understanding of the history of our country. And I think that if you teach our young people that our country is not worth defending, then like who's going to defend you, right? And what I'm talking about in particular is the big influence of kind of the New Left interpretation of history, various postmodernist, post-colonial theories that organize the world into oppressor and oppressed and sort of valorize victimhood and rob people from agency, because every problem that you face, whether it's racism, whatever it is structural, right? It's organizational. And what that leaves people with is a sense that they can't change it, right? And the emotion you're left with is anger, right? Or resignation, or both, which is destructive. And so our republic is imperfect. Our founders knew it was imperfect from the beginning. They knew that our republic would require what they called constant nurturing. We did not end the criminal institution of slavery until almost 100 years after our founding. We ended it, however, in our bloodiest war in our history, when we emancipated 6 million of our fellow Americans. Of course, that journey wasn't over. There were huge setbacks in terms of the failure of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan, separate but unequal. but there was the great triumph of the civil rights movement, which ended, de jure segregation and inequality of opportunity. But of course, de facto, inequality of opportunity remains, right? It still matters, we know this, that into which zip code you're born, because that determines how many obstacles you have to overcome before you take advantage of the great promise of this country. Is that wrong? Yes, so let's do something about it. I think what we have to really do is restore a sense of agency. What I see in the military is I see young men and women come from all different walks of life. I mean, they'll bring biases with them. They'll have sort of legacy maybe of bigotry or sexism or whatever. But our military culture is fundamentally intolerant of that. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? But our military culture is fundamentally intolerant of any kind of bigotry or racism or sexism because it's destructive to combat effectiveness. And when people tell you, hey, you should judge the person next to you based on their identity category, that's like anathema to the military. No, I judge the soldier next to me based on, his or her toughness, courage, willingness to sacrifice for one another, And so I think, we have to, get over this kind of, I think, this kind of, fetishizing, I don't know what to call it, various critical and postmodernist theories. It's okay to teach it, right? This has been a tradition in the American Academy since Charles and Mary Beard, at least, and William Appleman Williams and others. But it shouldn't be an orthodoxy that it comes to dominate our history and sociology and education departments, which it has, I think. So we don't want to replace it with a contrived, happy view of history, right? But I think what we need, I think, is a sort of revision to the revisionists in terms of how we teach young people about our country and how do we restore agency to them, I think.
Please join me in thanking General McMaster.
Thank you.
Feel good. Well, thank you all for coming. The fun doesn't stop now. We continue. We are going to be serving refreshments just out the door and around the corner if you'd like to join us for a little time of community and relationship building. Just to let you know, our next big event here on campus is set for November 21st. We will be welcoming some terrific scholars, including some from Seaver College and from SPP, as we welcome Robbie George to campus, who will be keynoting a half-day event on November 21st, looking at his book, Making Men Moral. So we'll be looking at issues of faith, policy, and politics. That's, again, November 21st. Thanks so much for joining us. And again, please stay with us for the reception afterwards. Thank you.